They say a bad weapon only becomes great in the hands of someone who understands it. But what if the weapon itself was never truly bad, only misunderstood? In 1942, the Bell P-39 Airacobra sat on airfields across the Pacific and Europe like an unwanted stray. British pilots despised it. American squadrons mocked it. Reports called it dangerous, underpowered, useless above 12,000 feet. One U.S. pilot joked, "If you see the enemy above you, don't worry, you'll never catch him anyway." The reason? A design decision that removed the turbocharger meant the P-39 could no longer fight at high altitude. Against Japanese Zeros and German Bf 109 seconds above the clouds, the Airacobra struggled. Pilots died trying to make it perform in a role it was never meant to fill. So America rejected it. Britain returned its order. The West wrote it off as a failure. And just when its story seemed over, a new chapter began. Because thousands of miles away, across a frozen ocean delivery route stretching from Alaska through Siberia to the heart of the Soviet Union, someone else saw potential. The Red Air Force didn't want a high-altitude interceptor. They wanted a close-range, low-to-medium-altitude dogfighter. They wanted firepower over ceiling, maneuverability over climb rate, brutal efficiency over perfection. And the P-39 was exactly that. A 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, machine guns in the nose, a cockpit positioned like a race car and a mid-engine layout that gave it balance and bite. The Soviets didn't fly it at 30,000 feet. They fought where the war truly lived, between 3,000 and 15,000 feet, where bombers, Stukas, and Luftwaffe fighters hunted over tank columns, trenches, and river crossings. And there, the Airacobra became a predator. Alexander Pokryshkin, future hero of the Soviet Union, rewrote air combat doctrine using the P-39. He trained pilots in coordinated radio tactics unheard of in the Red Air Force. His call sign, Sotka. His mantra, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. Pokryshkin alone scored 48 confirmed kills in the Airacobra. His comrade, Grigoriy Rechkalov, 56. Together, Soviet pilots flying P-39 seconds would claim over 3,000 victories. By war's end, the same aircraft Americans mocked had earned more aerial kills on the Eastern Front than any Allied fighter, except the P-51 Mustang and Yak-3. Some Luftwaffe pilots whispered that if they saw a P-39 below the clouds, they were already too late. The Airacobra never changed. Only the battlefield did. Only the pilots did. From Guadalcanal to the Kuban, it proved a truth often forgotten in war: technology doesn't win battles, understanding it does. And the fighter once branded America's worst became one of the deadliest tools in Soviet aviation history. It was the winter of 1942. Snowstorms howling across Siberia, engines freezing on the ground before they ever warmed in the air, when a strange fighter aircraft first appeared in Soviet hands, flown over thousands of miles from factories in Buffalo, New York, across Alaska, and into the Soviet Far East, under the dangerous Lend-Lease supply chain. Europe was already burning. Stalingrad trembled on the edge of collapse. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies with Bf 109 seconds and Fw 190 seconds, and every Soviet fighter pilot knew that control of the air wasn't just pride, it was survival. Lose the skies and your tanks burn. Lose the skies and your infantry die in open fields. Lose the skies and the war ends under a foreign flag. This was the world the Bell P-39 Airacobra entered. A battlefield where every advantage mattered and every mistake cost blood. And at first glance, the aircraft looked like an insult. Western air forces had already tested it and walked away shaking their heads. The British refused deployment after dangerously poor high-altitude results. American pilots flying in the Pacific joked that the plane was only good for scaring birds. A fighter that couldn't climb, a machine that overheated, a cockpit door that opened sideways like a car, raising eyebrows and doubts. But the Soviet Union didn't reject it. They studied it. They asked different questions. Was it perfect? No. Was it useful? That depended on where and how you fought. And the Eastern Front was unlike any other battlefield in the world. Here, aerial combat rarely happened high above the clouds. Battles took place close to the ground, ambushing Stukas, intercepting bombers, escorting Il-2 Sturmoviks, and breaking up German armored thrusts at treetop height. The war in the East wasn't a gentleman's duel. It was brutal, fast, and close. And in those conditions, the Airacobra wasn't weak. It was lethal. The Soviets immediately noticed what others had overlooked: a powerful 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub capable of shredding aircraft, vehicles, and even lightly armored targets with a single-hit heavy nose-mounted machine guns that made aiming simple and deadly, a mid-engine layout that provided balance, turning capability, and stability during hard maneuvers, and rugged construction that could survive the harsh freezing conditions of the Eastern Front. But even the best machine means nothing without the right hands, and those hands belong to men like Alexander Pokryshkin, a brilliant tactician whose IQ for aerial warfare rivaled Germany's greatest aces. He didn't just fly the P-39, he rewrote how it should be fought. Pokryshkin introduced coordinated radio tactics, altitude tracking grids, and ambush techniques that allowed his squadron to outthink and outmaneuver the Luftwaffe. His comrade Grigoriy Rechkalov pushed the aircraft to its limits, proving the Airacobra could be more than just a frontline asset. It could dominate. Together, along with countless Soviet pilots, they transformed the P-39 from a rejected design into one of the most feared fighters of the Eastern Front, claiming thousands of aerial victories and turning the tide in critical air battles like the Kuban Air Campaign. This story matters because it reminds us that history isn't written by what something was supposed to be, but by what determined people could make it become. It challenges the idea that technology alone decides outcomes. Instead, it shows that understanding, adaptation, and necessity can turn failure into supremacy. The P-39 wasn't redesigned. Its engine didn't magically grow stronger. The aircraft remained the same. What changed was the mindset, the mission, and the men who saw not weakness, but opportunity. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes a weapon simply needs the right battlefield and the right warrior to reveal its true purpose. This is the story of the fighter they once laughed at, and the aces who turned it into a legend. Before the P-39 Airacobra ever fired a shot in Soviet hands, the world was already deep in chaos and uncertainty, and the skies over Europe and the Pacific had become brutal proving grounds for every new aircraft design. In the late 1930s, when the Bell Aircraft Company first proposed the Airacobra, it wasn't meant to be ordinary. It was imagined as a revolutionary, cutting-edge fighter with its engine placed behind the pilot and a powerful 37mm cannon, firing through the propeller hub. On paper, it promised speed, firepower, and innovation. But between blueprints and battlefields, something changed. As the U.S. entered World War II, priorities shifted, materials were rationed, and the turbo supercharger originally meant for high-altitude combat was dropped to simplify production. What remained was a fighter optimized for low and medium altitude, something the U.S. and Britain didn't think they needed. So when the first P-39 seconds reached American pilots in the Pacific and RAF units in Europe, expectations collapsed fast. Reports came in, low climb rate, engine reliability issues, poor high-altitude performance, and dangerous cockpit quirks. Pilots trained for high-altitude interception missions found themselves flying a machine built for a different kind of war. Many couldn't see its potential because they were fighting the wrong fight with it. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, the Soviet Union was bleeding. Operation Barbarossa had smashed across its borders in June 1941, leaving entire Soviet air regiments destroyed on the ground before ever taking off. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies with experienced pilots and technologically superior aircraft using altitude and precision to control the battle space. Soviet pilots frequently flew outdated fighters like the I-16 or new designs lacking proper radios or reliable engines. Their training was short, their survival rates low, and the Red Army could feel the weight of German air power crushing cities, convoys, and soldiers alike. The Eastern Front became a battlefield defined by extremes, blistering summer heat, mud seas in autumn, and winters cold enough to freeze engines solid. Air battles weren't fought at elegant altitudes with sweeping maneuvers. They happened low, fast, and violent, just above the treetops and over rivers where armies clashed in brutal ground combat. That was where the war was decided, and that was where the Soviets needed a fighter that could strike hard, fast, and survive. So when the first P-39 seconds began arriving via the treacherous Alaska-Siberia ferry route, a journey so cold that mechanics warmed instruments with bonfires and pilots sometimes navigated by instinct rather than maps, the Soviets inspected the machine with a very different mindset. Instead of criticizing what it couldn't do, they focused on what it could. The 37mm cannon, perfect for knocking down bombers or obliterating enemy aircraft with a single burst. Heavy nose-mounted guns, ideal for precision. Mid-engine layout and tricycle landing gear, excellent stability in takeoff and landing on rough Soviet runways. Radios, actual reliable radios, were rare gold in the Red Air Force, enabling tactics that before had been impossible. But a machine, even a good one, needs the right mind behind it. And that's where figures like Alexander Pokryshkin entered the story. He was not just a pilot, he was a thinker, a strategist, someone who questioned old doctrine and sought innovation. To him, the P-39 wasn't a flawed aircraft. It was an untapped weapon waiting to be understood. Alongside him were future legends like Grigoriy, Rechkalov, and Boris Glinka, young men hardened by loss and driven by duty. They trained not to survive, but to dominate. Early missions revealed the aircraft's personality. It excelled in high-speed dives, tight horizontal turns, and sudden brutal ambushes. German pilots, used to having altitude advantage, began to make mistakes. Surprise attacks replaced desperate evasions. Soviet formations shifted from chaotic scrambling to coordinated hunting. Slowly, the tide shifted, not because the aircraft changed, but because the understanding did. Word spread through Soviet regiments, the Cobra fights well low. Treat it like a dagger, not a spear. And with every mission, every victory, every adaptation, the reputation of the Airacobra transformed. What Western pilots dismissed became the backbone of Soviet air superiority in key regions, especially during critical campaigns like the Kuban Air Battles. The atmosphere across the front shifted from desperation to determination, the sense that, finally, they had a weapon suited to the war they were forced to fight, and as pilots mastered it, confidence replaced doubt. German pilots who once ignored the strange American import soon learned to fear it. Something remarkable was unfolding. A misunderstood aircraft and a desperate air force were reshaping each other, and history was about to notice. The stage was set, the pilots ready, and the machine, once a failure, was about to become a legend. The war was entering its next chapter, and the Airacobra was waiting for its moment. Now the question was no longer whether it belonged in the war, but how far it could go. And that moment began here. The morning sky over the Kuban was pale and cold, streaked with early sunlight cutting through thin mist, when a squadron of P-39 Airacobras climbed steadily from their forward airfield, engines snarling like predators waiting to strike. Among them flew Alexander Pokryshkin, calm, focused, his gloved hand resting lightly on the throttle as his eyes scanned the horizon, not for beauty, but for survival. Below them, battle raged along the Taman Peninsula. Artillery thundered, tank engines roared, and black smoke curled upward from burning vehicles. German bombers, Heinkels and Junkers, were already moving towards Soviet positions escorted by sleek Bf-109 seconds weaving through the sky like wolves guarding their prey. As the Soviet formation approached, Pokryshkin keyed his radio and spoke his now famous words: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. His pilots understood: no unnecessary calls, no panic, no chaos. They would strike fast and without hesitation. The P-39s dropped altitude sharply, using gravity to build speed, the airframe shuddering as wind screamed along the fuselage. German pilots saw them too late. The Airacobras punched through the formation with terrifying force. Nose guns lit up. The 37mm cannon thundered like a hammer from hell. A single round tore into a Ju-88 bomber, its wing erupting in flame as it spiraled downward, engines trailing black smoke. One kill, then another. The sky transformed in seconds from quiet formation flight to explosive chaos. Tracer rounds carved glowing arcs through the air. Aircraft twisted and dove like furious birds locked in mortal combat. German pilots who once believed the P-39 to be inferior suddenly found themselves engaged at the worst possible altitude, exactly where the Soviet fighters excelled. Pokryshkin's wingman shouted a warning, 2 Messerschmitts dropping from above. Pokryshkin didn't run. Instead, he rolled the Airacobra into a sharp scissors turn, using its low-altitude stability and brutal acceleration. The German overshot, too fast, too shallow. Pokryshkin fired, 3 short bursts. The 109 snapped into a fireball. Below him, Grigoriy Rechkalov was deep in pursuit of another fighter, pushing his Airacobra to the limits, the engine growling as he closed in. The German pilot, realizing too late he couldn't escape, attempted a desperate climb. But the P-39 stayed stuck to his tail. Stable, steady, merciless. One squeeze of the trigger. The Messerschmitt disintegrated into smoking wreckage. For the Germans, panic spread. This wasn't the clumsy, sluggish aircraft they'd heard about. This was something else, something dangerous. And now the tone of the battle shifted. The Luftwaffe escorts, overwhelmed and thrown off balance, began to scatter, leaving their bombers exposed. That was the turning point. The Soviet fighters moved in with precision, tearing through the formation before it could retreat. One Ju-87 Stuka tried diving low to escape, its siren screaming, but the Airacobra followed, keeping the pressure, its cannon blasting until the German aircraft slammed into the earth in a plume of dirt and fire. By the time the sky fell quiet again, the final German aircraft was fleeing west, leaving wreckage scattered across miles of airspace. Pokryshkin took a breath, slow, controlled, and radioed a simple message: mission complete. Return to base. On the ground, mechanics and soldiers watched as the Airacobras returned, wings scarred with bullet holes, engines smoking but victorious. Pilots climbed down from their cockpits, exhausted yet alive. Men who only months earlier were told the aircraft they flew was worthless. But now they knew better. They had seen what the Airacobra could do, not in theory, not in textbooks, but in fire and blood and survival. The battle that day wasn't just another mission. It was proof. Proof that a machine dismissed in one theater could become legend in another. Proof that war is not won by perfection, but by adaptation, courage, and the right hands at the controls. And from that day forward, the name Airacobra carried weight, not mockery, because in the skies over the Eastern Front, it had earned it. When the gunfire faded, and the wreckage of the Kuban Air Battles settled into scorched earth and smoldering metal, something far more significant than another tally in a logbook had occurred. Word spread through Soviet regiments like wildfire. The Airacobra worked, not just as a stopgap, not just as a curiosity, but as a weapon capable of changing the balance of power in the sky. And for the pilots who flew it, especially men like Pokryshkin and Rechkalov, the aftermath of that battle was more than a strategic victory, it was vindication. Before that day, many Soviet aviators still doubted the American machine parked on their snowy runways. They questioned whether a rejected foreign aircraft could survive the brutal conditions and savage tempo of the Eastern Front. But the Kuban skies erased that doubt. Mechanics began treating the P-39 differently, not as a fragile imported machine, but as a dependable war companion. They tuned the Allison engines with newfound respect, learning every vibration and quirk. Pilots requested Airacobras by name. They modified tactics, trained new squadrons, and rewrote the expectations of what a fighter aircraft should accomplish at low altitude. And slowly, as reports compiled, a staggering number emerged: over 3,000 confirmed aerial victories, credited to P-39 pilots, most of them Soviet. In time, the Airacobra became a cornerstone of Soviet air doctrine, especially in the later campaigns across Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Each encounter added proof the aircraft thrived in the environment it was never originally built for, but was somehow destined to dominate. German pilots, once confident and dismissive, adjusted their tactics as well. Luftwaffe briefings warned, "Do not engage P-39 seconds below 5,000 meters unless you have the advantage." Some later memoirs from German veterans spoke of the Airacobra with irritation, even respect. On a personal level, the victory transformed Pokryshkin's legacy. He wasn't merely a skilled ace. He became one of the greatest tacticians of the war, eventually recording 48 aerial victories and becoming a three-time hero of the Soviet Union. For younger pilots, he was more than a commander. He was proof that the right mind could unlock the potential of any machine. Rechkalov's record soared as well, making him one of the highest-scoring aces to fly a Lend-Lease aircraft. But success came with complications. Fame drew rivalry. Rivalry sowed tension, and leadership became heavier than the aircraft controls ever were. Still, the victories continued. And as the war shifted westward and the Red Army advanced into Germany, the P-39 was there, strafing convoys, crushing Luftwaffe remnants, escorting ground attack aircraft, and ensuring the skies belonged to the Red Star. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Airacobra, once laughed at, stood among the most successful Allied fighters on the Eastern Front. Yet its legacy remained split between two worlds. In the West, it stayed labeled as a failure, an aircraft outperformed by the P-47, Spitfire, and Mustang. In museums and documentaries, it became a footnote, an experiment overshadowed by legends. But in the East, its true story survived. The Airacobra became a symbol not of perfection, but of potential realized through necessity, adaptation, and courage. The war ended, but its lesson remained painfully clear. A machine is only as effective as its mission, and the people who wield it. The P-39 never changed, the world around it did. And because a group of determined pilots refused to accept the limits others placed on it, history now remembers it not as America's worst fighter, but as one of the deadliest weapons of the Eastern Front. It was more than steel, fuel, and firepower. It was proof that sometimes greatness isn't born, it's discovered. In the end, the story of the P-39 Airacobra isn't just about metal engines, guns, or design choices. It's about what happens when something or someone dismissed, underestimated, and misunderstood is finally given the right conditions to prove their worth. The aircraft never magically improved. It never gained the turbocharger it lacked or the altitude performance the West demanded. What changed was the belief surrounding it, and the people willing to look beyond the flaws and see potential. Men like Pokryshkin, Rechkalov, and thousands of Soviet pilots took a machine written off as a failure and turned it into a weapon feared across the Eastern Front, because they approached it with discipline, innovation, and relentless courage. Their story reminds us that success isn't always about having the best tool. It's about knowing how to use what you have with skill, purpose, and conviction. It's about adaptation under pressure, seeing opportunity where others see limitation, and refusing to let first impressions dictate destiny. The Airacobra teaches a quiet but powerful truth. Sometimes the world won't recognize your value until the right battlefield finds you. So ask yourself, not as a historian, but as someone living your own battles, how many great things, great people, great ideas have been discarded not because they were incapable, but because no one looked closely enough to understand them? And more importantly, when history offers you a role, will you judge by limits or by possibilities? In the end, the P-39 Airacobra went from being rejected and laughed at to becoming one of the most feared fighters of the Eastern Front, a machine that proved its worth not through perfection but through the grit, skill, and will of the pilots who flew it. The men who mastered it didn't just change its reputation, they changed the outcome of battles, saved countless lives, and rewrote what history believed possible. What began as doubt ended as dominance. What was once considered America's worst fighter became a Soviet legend responsible for more than 3,000 aerial victories and some of the greatest aces ever recorded. The story of the Airacobra isn't just the story of an airplane, it's the story of potential realized, of underestimated, strength rising when the world least expected it. And long after the smoke cleared and the war was won, its legacy endured as a reminder that sometimes a miracle is simply a misjudged tool in the right hands. A forgotten machine became a hero of the skies, and the war, because of it, changed forever.